saying all morning. So this is Anderson basically pointing out that when we look at the Bodo-Garo languages, we are looking at languages that descend from a population that dominated the Brahmaputra Valley for at least the last 1,500 or 2,000 years. Right? So at least since the fall of Kamarupa, we know that all of the succeeding dynasties up until the Ahams came in were Lecce dynasties or whatever. They must have been speaking some kind of Bodo-Garo. Right? Probably farther back than that. This is just making that point. Okay, now in the Mahabharata, so there was some discussion earlier about dating the Mahabharata. I think it's clear that there is no one date for the Mahabharata. Right? There were many versions of this written over time. We know that the present version that we look at, we have copies of it dating back to about 200 AD. So, but in the Mahabharata that we have, the armies of Kokrajhar are described as including Kiratas and Chinese, right? Using the word Chinese, which is the Sanskrit word for Chinese. Now, okay, we've already had this discussion, I don't need to go into that, but the Chinese state was only referred to as Chinese. The word Chinese comes from the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty is 200 BC. Okay. Before 200 BC, nobody called the Chinese state China, including the Chinese, including Sanskrit, including anybody. That means that this version of the Mahabharata, or at least this line in the Mahabharata, cannot be older than 200 BC. Right? Some other parts of the Mahabharata may be older, or this line may have been changed or whatever. But this reference to Kiratas and Chinese has to be later than 200 BC. And of course, this is only the beginning of the dynasty. Nobody in India would have heard about the Qin dynasty until much later than that. So really, all we know from this is that 2,000 years ago, people were talking about Chinese being in the army of Kokrajhar. So whenever the actual battles of a Mahabharata might actually have happened, this story about there being Chinese in Kiratas is not more than 2,000 years old. Not more than about zero. Now, surely there were not Chinese soldiers in the armies of Kokrajhar. That seems historically implausible. But what this means is that whoever wrote that version of the Mahabharata was aware that the armies of the kings in the Brahmaputra Valley included people who looked like East Asians rather than like South Asians. Or, as we keep saying here, the Great Mongoloid race. So we already know very plausible there were soldiers of East Asian appearance. Well, of course, there are people of East Asian appearance all over the Northeast now. We know from this that it goes back at least that far. Okay, this is what I just said. So, by about 2,000 years ago, the kings of Kamarupa, and we don't need to argue about whether the kings of Kamarupa were Aryans, or were Bodos, or were Austric, or were Austric or Bodos pretending to be Aryans or whatever. What we do know is that the armies were East Asian looking, or Mongoloid, not South Asian. So already there were these people here, and some of these must have been speaking the ancestor of Bodo-Garo. So we can trace the Bodo-Garo languages back 2,000 years absolutely without any question. Older than that was speculated. But if by this point the kings had armies that were all East Asian looking, then we have to assume that these people people had been here longer than that, so we can trace ancestral speakers of ancestral Bodo-Garo back to at least several centuries BC. Okay? Very possibly more than that, but this gives us clear evidence that it has to be at least that far back. Okay. Now, we notice that the modern distribution of Bodo-Garo languages, well, it's broken up by Assamese now. But we know that the spread of Assamese is since the Ahom conquest about 800 years ago. So prior to that, this is pretty much the distribution of Bodo-Garo languages, right? Juri, Dimasa, Kokrajhar, Bodo, Mech, Garo, okay? And it certainly does look like pretty much the outline of the ancient kingdom of Kokrajhar. So, again, without getting into the argument about who exactly the rulers of Kokrajhar are, it's pretty clear that the lingua franca that was used throughout that kingdom was Proto-Bodo-Garo. So, this, I think, is what we can think of as the beginning of what we now see as the Bodo language. And our next question is, what is the earlier ancestry of that form? In particular, Bodo-Garo languages, if we compare them with their nearest cousins, and I'll show you what I mean by that in a minute, the nearest cousins, linguistically, to the Bodo-Garo languages are what we call the Northern Naga or Konyak languages of Upper Assam and Sagaing State in Myanmar. And those languages are absurdly complex. They're kind of, in a way, not Sanskrit-like, but similarly to Sanskrit, they have irregular verbs, they have complicated verb agreement paradigms, all sorts of things which are completely gone in Bodo-Garo. One of the striking things about Bodo-Garo languages is how regular they are. There are no irregular verbs. There's nothing really you have to learn and memorize the way there is even in English. We now understand that when languages have that kind of grammar, this usually results from contact. That is, it usually results from, for example, what I think is the case here, one language conquering another population. So I'm imagining here we have pre-Bodo-Garo invaders coming into Assam. Of course, there were already people in Assam, probably speaking Austric languages. All right. Those people then had to learn the language of their conquerors. And in that circumstance, when people learn another language, they don't memorize, they don't sit up nights memorizing tables of irregular verbs. They learn the language as best they can and go on with their business. Okay. So, I think that the form of Bodo-Garo grammar came about as pre-Bodo-Garo speakers conquered the inhabitants of Assam, or at least were the armies of the kings of Assam. Okay, let's see if we can trace this back a little bit farther. So, when we talk about the Tibeto-Burman language family, okay, almost all of the languages in northeast India belong to the Tibeto-Burman family. There are a few Indo-Aryan exceptions, the Austric languages of Meghalaya, a few Thai-Ahom languages in Upper Assam. Everything else is Tibeto-Burman. This is sort of the distribution of the Tibeto-Burman languages. Now, you'll notice that they are all concentrated in mountainous areas. This is not coincidental. People used to say that this shows that the Tibeto-Burmans were originally mountain people, and they have an affinity for mountain living. Nowadays, I would say more likely that this pattern is a result of the expansion of here, the expansion of Burmese specifically in the plains here, the expansion of Chinese in the plains here, so that once upon a time, Tibeto-Burman speakers probably covered all of this area, and the languages which remain are those up in the mountains that were never conquered by the expanding valley people like the Chinese and the Inuarians. Okay, I think, this is not a universal opinion, but I think there are three main branches of Tibeto-Burman. Western, Central, Eastern. The Eastern basically are the languages that we find in China, and there are all of these subgroups, which we don't really talk about. The Western are the languages which spread along the Himalayas from western Arunachal over into Ladakh. These include Tibetan, the group that Tibetan belongs to, Kiranti languages in Nepal, which we've talked about, many other groups. What we're interested in is the central group, which includes a branch which we call Sal, which I'll talk about in a little bit, which itself includes Bodo-Garo. Basically, all of the languages of Northeast India, essentially, plus Jingpa, and that's an interesting one we'll get to. Now, everybody has been citing the old idea of the homeland of the Tibeto-Burmans as somewhere up on the headquarters of the Huanghe and the Yangtze River. It's actually probably a little bit closer to here than that. So, if we look right here, you'll notice that the Huanghe, the Yangtze, the Mekong, the Salween, the Irrawaddy, and the Brahmaputra and Sangpo, all right in this area pass within about 150 kilometers of each other. If we imagine that this is the center of dispersal for the Tibeto-Burman languages, then we have a neat explanation for where we find them all. Okay, up along the Huanghe, that's where Chinese went. Along the Yangtze, that's the Jaronic and Changik. Down the Mekong is the Lower Burmese. Down the Salween is Jingpa and the Pyu languages of Burma. Down the Chinquin Irrawaddy is Kuki-Chin and the Naga languages. And then out along the Tsangpo, that gives us the Western languages, Tibetan and so on. And then the other way downstream, down the Brahmaputra, that gives us Bodo-Garo. Okay. So the most economical idea for homeland is not really up here, which is where everybody used to say, but down in this area, which gives us a very clear explanation for why we find the languages where we now find them. Okay, a little bit closer in, and we see that obviously Bodo-Garo languages are those which went down the Brahmaputra Valley, because that's where we find them all. So, I mentioned that in my view there are three major branches, one of those being the central Tibeto-Burman branch, and that includes Jingpo and several small relic languages found in Burma and in Manipur. What George Van Dreams calls Brahmaputran, which is Bodo-Garo plus the northern Naga languages. Kuti Naga, which is Kuki-Chin, Naga, Charmi, Mede. Also some of the languages of Arunachal. So people have been talking about Yising. Yising belongs to the Tani subgroup. Okay. I believe that all of these constitute one major branch of Tibeto-Burman. And this set, so Bodo-Garo, Jingpa, and the northern Naga languages, Robbins Burling, a linguist who spent a great deal of time in the Northeast in the So everywhere else in Tibeto-Burman, the word for sun is something like nye or ne or ni. In Bodo it's san, in Jingpo it's jan, in Note it's san. In some of the other languages, we can see that originally this ended in an L, so this is why he calls these the Sal languages. I've had people ask me from time to time, Bodo students and others, is it true that we borrowed our word from sun for sun from English and that we never had a word for sun before? Because, of course, the word sun sure looks like English. No, it's not true. Actually, the history of this is sal is an old Proto-Tibeto-Burman word meaning to dry things in the sun, like to put out grass or clothing or whatever in the sun to dry. And in these languages, they simply adopted that word to refer to the sun itself. Other evidence, this is only going to be of interest to linguists, and there are only 2 linguists here, so I won't bother with this much. But I said there are no irregular verbs in Bodo. Actually, there are 2. One is dong, meaning to be at a place or to live or to exist, and the other is nang, meaning to be. But dong has this o suffix which no other verb has, right? If I say I go, that would be tamil, not tamil, right? But here we have this o. Well, in the Northern Navajo languages, likewise, this is an irregular verb that has a special ending that doesn't occur on any other verb. These are the kind of details that linguists look at when we are trying to decide what languages are closely related to each other. Okay. Now, there's also evidence to link these Sal languages with Karbi and Mete, the Nama languages in Kokrajhar. We don't really need to go into that now. Okay. But the tree of central Tibeto-Burman looks something like this. So, basically, we had a central Tibeto-Burman offshoot from Tibeto-Burman. That, in turn, divided up into 2 groups, the Kuki-Nago group and the Sal group. The Sal group then divided up basically into Jingpo and everything else. And then at some later time, and I would guess this is maybe 3,000 years ago, Bodo-Garo split off from this, and I think this is the point at which the original ancestors of Bodo-Garo came down the Brahmaputra and established themselves in the Assam Valley. Okay. So these are the central languages, just so we have some idea of what we're talking about. And basically I'm saying the Sal languages are these across the north. Jingpo, Northern Nara, Bodo-Garo, and then Kokrajhar, Nada languages are these here. Karbi, various Nada languages, and Kokrajhar. If remembering this as our idea of the center of dispersal for the Tibeto-Burman languages, then we can see that the central languages started out over in the western part of this. Okay, so if we are trying to look back geographically to where did Bodo-Garo originate, it's not way up here somewhere. It's right here, over in southern Tibet, northern Burma, in the headwaters of the Chingwan-Irrawaddy Valley. And the origin of Bodo-Garo is some group of this that moved across from the Irrawaddy-Chingwan Valley to the Brahmaputra Valley, moved down here. Now, of course, there were already people in Assam. There were already people in the Brahmaputra Valley. Okay. There have been people in the Brahmaputra Valley for 50, 60,000 years. Long before there were any Tibeto-Burman or Austric or Aryan or anything, there were people living here. So when these migrants came down the valley, they found people living there already. I would guess they probably spoke Austroasiatic languages, although there's... Well, we can't prove that yet. One day we will prove it, and we will prove it by examining the Bodo-Garo vocabulary. If we look at the vocabulary of the Bodo-Garo languages, there are many, many words that are not Tibeto-Burman. If they are not Tibeto-Burman, they came from somewhere else. Some of them came from Indo-Aryan, some of them didn't. Those came from somewhere, probably from whoever was living here when the ancestors of the Bodo-Garos first came in. At some point, we will be able to separate those out and try and see if they look Austrasiatic or what. For now, this is speculation. But anyway, this is the formation of the Bodo-Garo language, and I would say the origin of the Bodo-Garo people as a distinct group is when some central Tibeto-Burman speaking group moved over the hills into the valley here, expanded, spread their influence across whoever was living there already, and that is where, in exactly the same way that if we talk about the origin of the Assamese, we would not say the Assamese came from the steppes of Russia. We would not say that at one time the Assamese were living side by side with the English there, right? Assamese are what developed when Indo-Aryan invaders came in and established themselves as dominant over the people who were there already, who were Bodo-Garo speakers. Just as Bodo-Garo is what happened when these folks came into the valley and established themselves as dominant over the people who were there already, who would have been Austrian. So by the time we get to Assamese, we actually have 3 or 4 layers. The original Austrian speakers, the Tibeto-Burman speakers who came in and formed the Bodo-Garo people, the Ahom coming in from the side and bringing a little Thai influence, and then Indo-Aryan speakers coming from the mainland, coming over and adding themselves to that mix. Okay, we don't need that. Okay, I just said that. And I just said that. And I just said that. So, the question that's remaining, and that I know is of great interest to people interested in Bodo history and Bodo origins, is who was really dominant? So there must have been city-states, there must have been urban civilization in the Brahmaputra Valley before the Kamarupan kingdom. So the Mahabharata talks about Kokrajhar. Kokrajhar must have been there several centuries before the Kamarupan kingdom, so several centuries BC. And then I hear people arguing about, oh, well, who were the kings of these kingdoms?